There is a moment, and if you are watching this, you may have already lived it, when the life you spent years constructing simply stops working. Not dramatically, not all at once. It begins quietly, the way a fault line shifts before the ground opens. You wake one morning and the familiar things feel strange. The job that once gave you purpose feels hollow. The relationships you maintained with such care feel like costumes worn by strangers. The version of yourself you presented to the world, confident, capable, composed, starts to feel like a performance you no longer have the energy to give. And the terrifying part is, you cannot point to a single catastrophic reason. Nothing collapsed, nothing was taken, and yet something has ended. The world will call this a breakdown. Carl Jung called it something else entirely. He called it the beginning. And before you move past that word, beginning, sit with it for a moment. Because Jung was not being optimistic. He was not offering consolation. He was describing something he observed in himself, in his patience, in the mythologies of cultures across millennia. That the human psyche, when it has grown too large for the container the ego built for it, will shatter that container. Not out of malice, out of necessity. The psyche is not trying to destroy you when it pulls the floor out from under you. It is trying to make room for what you are actually becoming. This video is about that process. It has a name, it has a structure, it has a beginning, a descent, and, if you are willing to stay with it rather than escape it, an emergence that changes the entire architecture of who you are. If your life is falling apart and you cannot explain why, stay with this. Before Jung developed his theories of individuation and the unconscious, he was a man very much in crisis himself. People rarely speak about this. They speak of Jung the visionary, Jung the theorist, Jung the founder of analytical psychology. They speak less often of Jung between 1913 and 1916, the years after his break with Freud, the years he described as his own confrontation with the unconscious. He called it his nekia, borrowing the ancient Greek word for the ritual descent into the underworld. He wrote in his Red Book that he deliberately went toward the disorientation, deliberately invited the imagery, deliberately stood at the edge of what many of his contemporaries would have diagnosed as psychosis. He was not having a breakdown. He was having a transformation nobody had warned him about. And he spent the rest of his life trying to warn others. What he discovered, through those years of descent and careful documentation, is that the psyche has its own logic, older, deeper, and far more intelligent than the conscious mind likes to acknowledge. The ego, the part of you that plans and narrates and presents itself to the world, operates with a kind of arrogance it rarely recognizes. It believes it is in charge. It believes it knows who you are. It has built a life accordingly, a career that makes sense on paper, relationships that fit a recognizable pattern, a self-image that holds together under ordinary conditions. And then something in you grows beyond that container. This is the moment most people experience as breakdown. Jung experienced it as the psyche demanding expansion. There is a concept in alchemy, and Jung returned to alchemy again and again throughout his later work, because he believed the alchemists were not just trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to describe the transformation of the human soul, called nigredo. It is the first stage, the blackening, the stage in which the original matter must be broken down entirely before it can be reconstituted into something new. The medieval alchemists called it putrefaction, the dissolution of what was, the rotting of the old form. This is what a psychological breakdown actually is, when understood through the Jungian lens. Not a failure, not evidence of weakness, not proof that something has gone wrong with you. It is nigredo. It is the blackening that precedes all genuine transformation. The psyche is dissolving the lead, the hardened, rigid, defended version of yourself that served a purpose once and has now outlived that purpose, so that something else can take form. The suffering of nigredo is real. Do not misunderstand this. Jung did not romanticize it. He nearly lost himself in it. What he did insist, and what his entire body of work insists, is that the suffering is not meaningless. It has direction, it has intention. Not in the sense that some external force is punishing you or testing you, but in the sense that the psyche itself is purposive. It moves toward wholeness. It always moves toward wholeness. And sometimes the only path toward wholeness runs directly through the thing you have been most afraid to feel. There is a figure that appears in dreams during this period of transformation. You may have encountered it without knowing its name. It comes at night, sometimes as a dark stranger at a threshold, sometimes as a flood rising through the rooms of a house you somehow know is yours, sometimes as a descent, a staircase going down into darkness, a cave, an underground passage through which you move with some mixture of dread and compulsion. Sometimes it is simply a figure standing in shadow, watching, neither threatening nor entirely safe. Jung called this figure the shadow. Not the shadow of objects, not metaphor in the vague, loosely literary sense. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is a specific structure within the unconscious. It is everything about yourself that you have not been able to consciously integrate. Every quality that was shamed out of you in childhood. Every emotion that was too large or too inconvenient for the people around you to tolerate. Every desire, every rage, every grief that was pushed below the surface and left there. The shadow does not disappear when it is pushed away. It grows heavier, it gains density. And during periods of breakdown, during nigrido, during the life that stops working, it begins to press against the surface. This is why transformation feels so terrifying. It is not simply that your external circumstances are shifting. It is that the parts of yourself you have spent years managing, suppressing, performing around are suddenly refusing to stay buried. When people describe a breakdown, they often describe exactly this. Emotions that seem disproportionate to their circumstances. Rage at small things, grief with no clear object. A darkness that seems to come from inside, rather than from anything that has happened. They feel out of control. They feel like they are losing themselves. What they are actually experiencing. And this is perhaps the most important thing this video will say, is not the loss of the self. It is the loss of the persona. And these two things are not the same. The persona is one of Jung's most precise and underappreciated concepts. The word comes from the Latin. It was the term for the mask worn by actors in Greek theatre, a physical object held before the face to amplify the voice and signal the character being played. Jung chose this word deliberately. The persona is the mask. It is the self-presentation you have constructed in response to what the world has asked of you. Every persona begins as an adaptation. A child learns very early which version of themselves receives love, acceptance, approval, which emotions are welcomed, which are met with silence or punishment or withdrawal. The persona forms around this information. It becomes the public face, the professional, the responsible one, the peacekeeper, the high achiever, the one who holds it together. It is not dishonest precisely, but it is partial. It is always partial. It emphasizes certain aspects of the self and buries others. The tragedy is that most people spend their entire lives believing they are their persona. They identify with the mask so completely that when the mask stops fitting, and it always eventually stops fitting, they experience this not as an invitation to grow but as the end of themselves. The breakdown is the mask cracking, and the transformation begins precisely in the space that the cracking opens. Jung's observed that this crisis tends to arrive at a specific threshold. He is well known for his concept of the midlife transition, often misunderstood as the midlife crisis, which in popular imagination involves sports cars and impulsive decisions. What Jung actually described was something far more interior and far more significant. A point, typically in the late 30s or 40s, when the questions that drove the first half of life, questions of achievement, identity, belonging, competence, begin to feel exhausted. The psyche stops being satisfied with the answers the ego has been offering. A deeper set of questions surfaces. What does my life mean? What have I left undiscovered in myself? What would I be if I were not what I have performed? But this threshold does not appear only at midlife. It appears wherever a life has been lived too narrowly. It appears after the career that consumed everything suddenly ends. It appears in the relationship that looked stable from the outside but had been hollow for years. It appears after loss, real loss, the kind that strips away all the careful structures you built around the knowledge of your own impermanence. It appears when the self you have been performing simply runs out of the energy required to keep performing. You will know this moment. If it has not come for you yet, you will recognize it when it does. The texture of it is unmistakable, a combination of exhaustion and restlessness, grief and strangeness, the disorienting sense that you are watching your own life from a slight distance, as if through glass. This is not pathology. This is the psyche insisting on something more. Here is where the archetype of the night sea journey becomes important. Jung drew on a myth that appeared across cultures, in Egyptian mythology, in the story of Jonah, in the descent of Inanna, in the harrowing of hell, the story of a hero who is swallowed into darkness, who travels through the belly of some vast and lightless creature, and who emerges on the other side transformed. Not the same person who went in, not restored to what they were, changed at the foundational level. He called this the night sea journey, the Nekia, and he recognized it not as an ancient story but as a living psychological reality. The psyche, when it undertakes genuine transformation, moves through a period of darkness that cannot be shortcut, cannot be intellectually bypassed, cannot be managed into safety. It must be traveled. This is the part that no one warns you about. Our culture is deeply uncomfortable with the night sea journey. We have entire industries, pharmaceutical, therapeutic, spiritual, motivational, built around the premise that darkness is a problem to be solved rather than a passage to be traveled. We pathologize the descent. We diagnose the blackening. We offer strategies to return as quickly as possible to the functioning, productive, socially legible self. And this is precisely why so many people get stuck. They interrupt the nigredo. They stop the dissolution before it can complete itself. They manage the symptoms without understanding what the symptoms are pointing toward. And so they carry, for years and sometimes for lifetimes, the weight of an unfinished transformation, a self that is neither the old persona nor the new thing trying to be born, a life suspended between what was and what is trying to become. The invitation, and it is an invitation, even when it feels like an assault, is to stay with it. Let's speak plainly about what staying with it actually requires. It requires, first, a radical revision in how you understand what is happening to you. If you are in the middle of what the world calls a breakdown, you are carrying a story about it. The story is probably one of failure, of weakness, of having somehow gotten it wrong. The story has a quality of shame at its center, the sense that a more together, more resilient, more capable version of yourself would not be here, would not feel this, would not be coming apart at the joints. Jung would want you to examine that story with tremendous skepticism, because the story of breakdown as failure is the ego's story. It is the persona defending itself, insisting on its own primacy, mourning its own dissolution as if the dissolution were a defeat rather than a doorway. The ego has excellent reasons to tell this story. Its entire identity depends on its own stability. It cannot, from within its own frame, see what the psyche is attempting. So it narrates the transformation as catastrophe. You are not required to believe everything your ego tells you about what is happening. What is actually happening is something the ego does not have the vocabulary for. The psyche is individuating. It is moving painfully, necessarily, irreversibly, toward a fuller expression of what you actually are. Individuations is Jung's term for this lifelong process, the movement of the psyche toward its own wholeness, the gradual integration of the unconscious with the conscious, the continuous and often difficult work of becoming more completely yourself rather than a well-polished performance of social acceptability. Individuation does not ask your permission. It does not wait for a convenient time. It arrives when the pressure inside the psyche has built beyond what the old container can hold, and it arrives in the form of exactly the experience you are trying to avoid. There is a question that surfaces in this territory. And if you have been sitting with a breaking open life for some time, you have probably already begun to ask it. The question is, what was I before all of this? Who am I without the roles, without the performance, without the structure that has collapsed? This is the right question, not the terrifying wrong turn, the right question. It is the question the psyche has been trying to get you to ask for a long time. Jung's answer is not a simple one. He does not offer a clean, stable identity to replace the one that has crumbled. What he offers instead is the concept of the self, distinct from the ego, distinct from the persona, capital self, which he understood as the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, integrated and not yet integrated. The self is not something you construct. It is something you discover through the very process of having the constructed thing fall apart. This is why the breakdown is, at its deepest level, not a loss but a revelation. What falls away is not you. What falls away is the layer between you, and yet, And this must be said carefully, because this experience is genuinely hard. The revelation does not arrive on a schedule. The night sea journey is dark for an actual stretch of time. The archetype of transformation does not offer a map with precise coordinates. What it offers is the knowledge, mythological, psychological, and for many people, spiritual, that others have traveled this passage before you, that the darkness has another side, that the dissolution has a direction. Dreams become crucial here in ways that waking life cannot quite replicate. During periods of genuine psychological transformation, the dreams intensify. They become more vivid, more emotionally charged, more insistent. They carry imagery that cannot be easily explained away. Great waters, underground passages, fire, strange guides, old houses with unexplored rooms. And if you are paying attention to them, if you are writing them down and sitting with them and allowing them to speak rather than dismissing them as the brain's nighttime noise, they will begin to reveal the shape of what is happening inside you. Jung believed the dream was the psyche's primary language for communicating what the conscious mind is not yet ready to acknowledge directly. He understood dreams not as disguised messages requiring decoding, but as expressions, genuine, symbolic, meaningful expressions of the psyche's current condition and direction. The unconscious is not hiding from you in your dreams. It is speaking to you. It is using the only vocabulary available to it, the vocabulary of image, symbol, archetype. If you are dreaming of water, particularly of floods or of crossing water, the psyche is speaking about the unconscious itself, its depth, its power, its capacity to overwhelm the structures the ego has built. If you are dreaming of houses with unknown rooms, you are dreaming about the unexplored parts of yourself. If you are dreaming of death, your own death, or the death of someone close, you are not receiving a prophecy. You are receiving a symbol. Something is ending. Something needs to end. The psyche is showing you the death of what has been in order to make space for what is coming. And if there is a dark figure in your dreams, a stranger, a shadow, a presence that frightens you, do not turn away from it. This is the shadow, asking to be known. In Jung's understanding, the figures in our dreams that most frighten us are often the carriers of exactly the qualities we most need to integrate. The rage we have been afraid to feel, the desire we have been ashamed of, the grief we never let ourselves finish. The shadow is not your enemy. It is a part of you that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be acknowledged. You do not have to resolve this in a single night of wakefulness, but you can begin simply by paying attention. There is a Jungian concept that does not appear often enough in popular discussions of psychology, and it is perhaps more relevant to the experience of transformation than almost any other: the transcendent function. Jung introduced this concept to describe something specific: the capacity of the psyche to generate a third position from the tension between two opposites. When the conscious and the unconscious are in genuine conflict, when what the ego wants and what the deeper self is demanding are pulling in entirely opposite directions, the psyche, if it is not forced toward premature resolution, will produce a symbol, an image, a dream, an unexpected insight, a feeling that arrives without obvious origin. And this symbol contains, in compressed form, a new possibility that neither the ego's position nor the unconscious's position could have arrived at alone. This is what transformation actually looks like from the inside most of the time. Not a thunderclap of clarity, not a sudden arrival at certainty, a symbol, an image, a dream that stays with you for weeks. A moment when something you read or heard or saw cuts through everything else and lands in you with a weight that makes no rational sense. A conversation with someone who says a thing that reorganizes everything. These are not accidents. These are the transcendent function at work. These are the psyche producing the new thing from the wreckage of the old. If you have been in this territory, you know these moments. You know the quality of them. They are unlike ordinary experience. They carry a sense, not quite religious, not quite rational, of significance, of something arriving from a deeper place. Trust them. Jung would say, these are not coincidences. These are the psyche speaking through the vocabulary it has available. Now let us speak about what this transformation is actually moving toward. Because this is not a video about suffering without purpose. The night sea journey has a destination. The nigredo moves toward something. In the alchemical language that Jung found so useful, the blackening, the nigredo, gives way eventually to the albedo, the whitening, the moment in which the dissolved matter begins to clarify. In psychological terms, this is the period when the fog begins to lift. Not all at once, not cleanly, but something in you begins to settle. A quality of life that was absent returns. Not because the external circumstances have improved necessarily, but because something in your relationship to yourself has shifted. You begin to know yourself differently. The old persona, the old mask, has lost its grip on your identity. You find that you can hold feelings that would previously have undone you. You find that the opinions of others, which once carried extraordinary weight, have somehow, quietly, become less determinative of your sense of your own worth. You find, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, that you are actually curious about who you are rather than certain of it. This is not the completion of the journey. The albedo is not the destination. The alchemical process continues to rubedo, the reddening, the stage in which the gold finally takes form. In psychological terms, this is the deepening of integration. This is what Jung meant by individuation as a lifelong process, not a single dramatic transformation after which you are permanently healed, but an ongoing, deepening relationship with the totality of what you are. The gold that emerges from the process is not a static object, it is a way of being. More honest, more capable of genuine feeling, more at peace with the parts of yourself you once needed to hide. More present to your own life rather than to the performance of it. There is an archetype that carries this entire movement, the breakdown, the descent, the emergence, the transformation, and it is perhaps the most important archetype for anyone watching this to understand. It is the archetype of the twice-born. The twice-born appears in mythologies across every culture on Earth. In Hinduism, initiation rites carry this name literally, the second birth being the spiritual birth that comes after the death of the merely social self. In Christianity, the language of being born again points toward the same structure. Dionysus, in Greek mythology, was literally born twice, once from his mortal mother and once after her death, sewn into the thigh of Zeus and reborn from the father of the gods. The shaman in indigenous traditions typically undergoes a symbolic death and dismemberment before receiving the gifts and vision that make the shamanic function possible. This is not coincidence. This is an archetypal pattern, a pattern so fundamental to the human psyche that it has appeared independently in remarkably similar form across cultures that had no contact with one another. And what all of these traditions are describing is the same psychological reality that Jung mapped with such precision, that there is a first life and a second life. The first life is lived largely from the outside in, shaped by family, culture, survival, adaptation, the construction of a workable persona. The second life is lived from the inside out. It is lived from the deeper self, from the integrated shadow, from the hard-won knowledge of who you actually are, rather than who you were told to be. The break between these two lives is the transformation nobody warned you about. It does not feel like a birth when you are in it. It feels like an ending. This is the nature of the twice-born experience. It cannot be known as a birth while it is being lived as a death. The understanding comes later, looking back across the darkness at the distance you have traveled. But here is what Jung offers, and here is what the entire tradition of the twice-born offers. You are not the first person to have stood in this darkness. The passage is real, the other side is real, and the person who emerges from this passage is not the diminished, broken version of who you were. They are the person you were always becoming. There is one more thing that must be said, and it concerns the people around you during this time. One of the most difficult aspects of genuine psychological transformation is that it rarely fits the expectations of those closest to you. The people who loved the persona, who oriented their relationship to you around the stable, predictable, well-managed version of yourself, often experience your transformation not as a positive development but as a loss. They may push back. They may express concern that has a quality of pressure to it. Pressure to return to what you were, to stabilize, to become again the person they were comfortable knowing. This is not cruelty, usually, it is fear. When someone who has been in a stable relationship with your persona encounters the self that is larger than the persona, the self that is less manageable and more alive, it disrupts the equilibrium they had organized their own life around. Their response is very human. But you cannot complete the twice-born passage by staying within the limits of what other people need from you. This is one of the harder truths in all of Jungian psychology. Individuation requires, at some point, the willingness to be more loyal to the self than to the image of yourself that others have come to depend upon. This does not mean becoming selfish. It does not mean abandoning the people you love or the commitments you have genuinely made. It means understanding that the most profound thing you can offer the people in your life, ultimately, over time, is not a well-maintained persona but a more genuinely integrated self. A person who knows their own shadow cannot project it as readily onto others. A person who has made the night sea journey comes back with something real to give. A capacity for genuine presence, genuine compassion, genuine understanding that the persona, for all its social competence, could never provide. So what do you do? If you are in it right now, if the life you built is cracking, if the person you thought you were is becoming unrecognizable even to yourself, what does Jung actually offer you? As practice, as direction, as something to do with your hands in the dark. He offers you attention, specifically, attention to the inner life in its full dimensionality. Write down your dreams, not to analyze them immediately, not to decode them into tidy meaning, but simply to honor them. To signal to the unconscious that you are paying attention, that you are willing to receive what it is trying to send. Sit with the images that arise, in dreams, in moments of reverie, in the fragments that surface when you are not busy managing things. Ask, not with the demanding impatience of the ego, but with genuine curiosity. What is this image showing me? What part of myself is speaking here? He offers you the concept of active imagination, the practice developed by Jung himself during his own night sea journey, of consciously engaging with the figures and images of the unconscious while remaining anchored in waking awareness. Not losing yourself in fantasy, not escaping into imagination, but entering into a genuine dialogue with the inner figures. The shadow, the unknown guide, the dream stranger at the threshold, is a state of conscious, watchful attention. He offers you, above all, a reframe, not a false comfort, not a premature promise of resolution, but a different story about what is happening to you. A story in which the breakdown is not the final word, but the first sentence of a different kind of life. A story in which the darkness is not the end, but the passage. A story in which you are not failing, but transforming, in the way that every human being who has ever genuinely grown has had to transform. Through descent, through loss of what was known, through the terrifying and ultimately liberating discovery of what was always there beneath the performance. Jung wrote, near the end of his life, that the most important question any human being can ask is, am I related to something infinite or not? He was not asking a theological question, precisely. He was asking whether you have made contact with the parts of yourself that are larger than the ego's small narrative of success and failure. Whether you have found, in the depths of your own inner life, something that is not merely conditioned, not merely social, not merely the product of what you were shaped to be, but something that was there before the shaping, something that has been waiting with enormous patience through all the years of the persona, through all the years of the performance, for you to finally stop running long enough to turn around and face it. That is what this process is, not a breakdown, not a failure of self-management, not evidence that something has gone wrong with you in some fundamental way that will require years of repair, a transformation, the kind nobody warned you about because it cannot fully be warned about, because the words for it are inadequate to the experience, because every person who travels this passage travels it, in some irreducible way, alone, accompanied by the wisdom of everyone who has gone before, guided by the symbols the psyche generates for exactly this purpose, but ultimately standing in their own particular darkness, facing their own particular self. You are not the first, you are not lost. The darkness has another side, and the person you will find there, the one the psyche has been laboring toward through all this dissolution and all this grief, is more real than anything the persona ever managed to construct. That person is who you are always going to be. If this spoke to something in you, subscribe and stay close to this channel. More is coming and it goes deeper. Leave in the comments what in your life is breaking open right now. What does the transformation feel like from inside it? Not what you think you are supposed to say. What is actually true for you? The work continues, and you are not alone in it.